Good evening and welcome to Chasing the Facts. I'm your host, Sam Chase, and with us this evening is Simon Cataldo. Did I pronounce that correctly?
You pronounced it perfectly,
Okay.
Sam.
Well, I went to school with a Cataldo family, so if I didn't get that right, I'd be in trouble. So Simon is a candidate for our newly drawn Middlesex 14th State Representative District. And we've got Simon on tonight to tell us a little bit about himself and his goals, reasons for running, and so forth. So what we typically do, Simon, is we start off and we ask our guests to just give us a brief biographical sketch, and then we'll get into the meat of the discussion.
Sam, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. As you said, I'm a candidate for the 14th Middlesex District, which in Chelmsford is precincts 7 through 11.
You got that right. That's what I have on my chart.
I'm glad we're on the same page about that. Sam, I'm a former public school special education math teacher, where I helped lead my students to the highest gains in the state math exam for former low-level performers in the school district. And out of that experience, I started what's now a national nonprofit for at-risk youth called Harlem Lacrosse. We work in 5 cities, from Boston to Los Angeles, serving over 1,300 children. And in leading that organization, I'm responsible for overseeing about 60 full-time employees who work for the organization and managing and overseeing a budget of about $6.5 million. In my second career, I became a federal prosecutor for the United States Justice Department, and I worked in a small section that exclusively prosecuted public corruption.
So you have a law degree, obviously.
I do.
Yes, okay.
So I worked on investigating and prosecuting public officials, everyone from elected officials to a judge to law enforcement officers, including former Sheriff Joe Arpaio of Arizona. Now I'm a husband and dad of 2 toddlers living back in the district where I grew up. I graduated from Concord Carlisle High School. We've lived and worked in pretty much every place in the country, but we decided to come back to this area because we think it's the best place to raise a family, and hopefully it will become a great place to grow old in our community. So I'm just really, really grateful to be part of this campaign, running for office for the first time.
Well, that's great, and you've got a good biography, and one of the things that I think is very important anyway is the breadth of experience that you bring to it. It's one thing if a person grows up and lives in an area and never gets more than 25 or 30 miles from where he grew up. It's quite another if somebody has had that kind of life experience that you've had, where you've actually lived in other parts of the country and you've done a number of diverse things in your professional background. So you've got a pretty good, at a young age, you've got a pretty good perspective, I would think. So I think that's something that is good to offer to any constituency that you're trying to represent. So you talked a little bit about the district, and just for those folks who may be watching, although this may be the 3rd or 4th time I've explained this, but I'm going to keep doing it because I get calls from people who want to understand what's happened.
And it's confusing.
It is confusing, I think. The state legislative districts have been redrawn, and that happens every 10 years as a result of the federal census. And in our particular case, we're focusing now on what is known as the 14th Middlesex District. And this is an area roughly that under the current lines is represented by Tammy Gouveia, okay? And from the Chelmsford perspective, it is precincts 1 and 9. Well, the new district in Chelmsford, as Simon said, comprises precincts 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, which is a much larger chunk of Chelmsford from a population standpoint than the current district represents. So you have those districts, those precincts in Chelmsford, which, by the way, are newly drawn precincts themselves, okay? You have the entire town of Carlisle, and you have 3 precincts in Concord and 4 in Acton. And so that represents from a Chelmsford standpoint, that represents a population shift, because it looks to me, although I haven't looked at the numbers, but just looking at the way the precincts are divided, I'm going to say that of the communities that you're representing, now Chelmsford has the largest voter population.
the largest population.
Yeah, and that's a shift, I think, from what the current situation is. So that's an interesting situation. So we, as Chelmsford folks, we need to pay a little bit more attention to this particular seat than perhaps we've paid in the past, because it's a larger number of people that are being represented. So does that make any sense?
I think it definitely does.
So that's
yeah.
what, I mean, that's what I get out of it. Do you happen to know what the population of Carlisle is off the top of your head? I should have looked that up, and I didn't.
It's between 4,000 and 5,000.
Oh, so that's, yeah, because when I grew up, Simon and I both come from the same hometown. I was born in Concord back in 19, and we won't discuss the age, but Carlisle, when I was a kid growing up, Carlisle was about 1,600 people in the 50s, so it was, you know,
It's grown quite a bit.
what we used to call a one-horse town, but now I think it's a three-horse town. I don't know. So nice town, Carlisle's. It's a nice area. So anyway, we're glad you're running for the seat, and one of the things that I'm interested in is your particular politics, and you bill yourself as a Democrat, which obviously you are a Democrat, but others have described you as a progressive Democrat. So I'm going to ask you to define what you think that means.
Yeah. So, Sam, thanks so much for that question. I think it's a really important one. This is my first foray into politics besides prosecuting politicians. And as I've been a
Democrats
candidate,
and Republicans, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. You know, corruption is an equal opportunity
Absolutely.
employer. And as I've been on a campaign, I've come to the opinion that labels such as progressive or moderate or conservative are often more confusing and sometimes divisive than they are informative to voters. I've heard you say on the show that you don't necessarily fit into any neat box.
I don't.
And I think most people are that way.
Yeah.
I'd like to think that I'm that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I hold some ideas and I think ideals that could be characterized as progressive. I'll give you an example, because I think it's really important to talk about issues instead of just kind of speaking in platitudes.
Yes.
So one thing that I think is really important right now and that I hear about a lot is the ability of young parents, in particular young moms, to re-enter the workforce after having a kid. And in Massachusetts, we have the second highest cost of childcare in the entire country. So what I'm hearing and seeing a lot is that moms who have a baby, usually it's moms, sometimes dads, when they want to go back into the workforce and work a middle-class job, it's very hard for them to find a job where they can make more after taxes than it costs to put a kid into daycare full-time. I think that's a really big problem. It's a big problem in terms of gender equity, but it's also a problem in terms of our tax base, because we want people who do want to work to be able to go back to work, and then they pay state income taxes. So one of the policies that I think is really important is figuring out what the state can do to rein in the cost of childcare. So I'm happy to call that a progressive idea. That would be fair, I think, but I think it's just an idea and a policy that's important to move us forward and bring opportunity to people who deserve it.
You know, I like that example, because again, you know, just from a 30,000-foot level, you might label that as a progressive idea. But when you sit down and you start to think about it, especially the way you just framed it, you know, in terms of mothers wanting to get back into the workforce at the appropriate time and so forth, and mostly, again, these would be middle-class type people, because if you're extremely wealthy, then A, maybe you don't need to get back into the workforce, and B, you don't care what the cost of child care is, okay? So what you're talking about is more of I'd say a bread and butter, broad-based issue. I would not label that, when you get into the nitty-gritty, I would not particularly label that a progressive agenda type issue. So I think you've explained that very well, okay? You did it so well, I won't even ask you for another example. How's that? But I think that's very important, and I'll just follow that up a little bit by saying that you're obviously a very bright person, and I think you know your constituency, and you probably are very well aware of what the politics in terms of philosophy is in your particular area in this Merrimack Valley. And although we are some might say we tend to be overrepresented by Democrats and people who lean politically left. Okay, that might be an observation. I think that's probably an accurate one in terms of the party labels and everything. But when you actually look at the demographics and the voting patterns of people in this particular district, we're more centrist than people from Boston might think, for example, okay? So, and I would say this to a conservative Republican, I would say the same thing, okay? When you are elected and you get in there, what I'm interested in is that you never lose sight of the fact of who you're representing. And if you do have a particular ideology, especially if it's a hard ideology, that you don't get caught up in that. If you are a progressive Democrat, for example, you can't ignore the conservative Republicans, okay? You have to listen to those people. And I say the same thing to the Republicans, okay? You know, you can't get in there in an ideology. And so I would just like you to expound on that a little bit, and maybe in terms of when you do get elected, you're going to be in an overwhelmingly Democratic legislature. But you are going to have to work with a few Republicans, and there are quite a few Democrats who do lean conservative in the Mass legislature. So I'm always interested to see, you know, how are you going to bridge those gaps, and does that cause you any difficulty? Are you comfortable with working with people that may have a diverse viewpoint from what you have, and even maybe diametrically opposed? So how would you?
Sam, this is one of the reasons I'm running. Because I think that even the fact that you have to ask that question,
and I do
which
have to
you
ask
which
that
you
question.
do,
Yes,
is reflective of the degradation of our political discourse. You know, my best friend and mentor is my 96-year-old grandfather who goes to work 3 days a week, and he's got two pictures in his kitchen. One is a drawing that I drew of a football player when I was 7 years old, and the other is Ronald Reagan. And he's had that thing, you know, forever. We probably don't agree on a bunch of political issues, but, you know, we love each other, and we agree on a lot of the bread and butter issues that, you know, are just about our community.
right.
The jobs that I've had have been completely apolitical in my life. This is, as I mentioned, my first political endeavor. So my first real job was as a special education teacher. It had nothing to do with politics. It only had to do with teaching my students. And when I went into the classroom, I realized that what the school's curriculum was providing didn't give the differentiated learning that in teaching that was necessary for my kids to learn. And so I had to look at every individual kid and figure out what they needed. I think that that is translatable to this job. Then when I worked at the U.S. Justice Department, I would go to court every day. I'd stand up and I'd say, Simon Cataldo for the United States. And that's not for, you know, Republicans, and it's not for Democrats. It's for everybody. And, you know, I would go to that job, and sometimes we would be prosecuting Republicans, and sometimes we would be prosecuting Democrats.
And I'm sure they needed it, all of them.
But I tried to approach that job in a very mission-driven way, not an ideological way. And the mission was just to do justice. And I think that's what people need, and we need to return that to politics and representative government in our society right now. This is why I feel the urge to run.
I have to tell you, I like that answer, because I think, just my opinion, that is the right answer, and you're certainly correct about the level of political discourse in this country, and it's awful. And, you know, people like to blame one or two people, but it's something that I've seen deteriorate over about a 25 or a 30-year period. Okay, it isn't just the last president or the last two presidents. They may have made it worse, okay, but it's just been a continual degradation, which I think is a great word to describe what that process has been. So very happy to hear you say that, and that you have that perspective, because if I may say so, a lot of people who are younger, in their 30s, they tend not to have that perspective. They're more ideologically driven and less able to compromise or even have a discussion. We ought to be able to disagree violently on a political issue, but at the end of the discussion...
Hopefully not too violent.
No. But at the end of the discussion, we ought to be able to say, hey, Simon, do you want to go out and get a cup of coffee?
That's right.
And that's what we're missing today, I think.
And I think, it's either that in terms of our younger people or complacency.
Yes.
And neither of those are good. And my humble belief is that the way to combat that is to get really involved in local politics. Because the local issues, they may not be the ones that you see on Twitter or on CNN or Fox News, but they are the ones that have the most immediate effect on our lives. And we have a lot of very local challenges that need to be addressed right now.
Let's talk about some.
Great.
Go ahead. You're doing well. I have the questions here, but I think you understand what we need to talk about. And you're absolutely correct. Especially in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is almost unique in the way we deliver our local services. We have 351 little kingdoms. Many times they're all doing the same thing. I think it's a horribly inefficient structure, but it's something that we have, and we have to try to make it work as well as we can, because it's not going to change. There are too many people with vested interests in keeping it the way it is. It's not going to change. So we have to make it work. And in this state, the towns and the cities are where the local services are delivered.
That's right.
Where the rubber meets the road, and where people are more likely to have contact with politicians is at the local level. So
that's right.
And the fact that you understand that is good, because a lot of folks don't understand that.
And that, I think, leads perfectly into my view of what this job is about, because there can be varying opinions on what a state rep is supposed to do.
Well, let's hear it.
I think a state rep is there to listen to what the needs of the towns in the district are, and then be a fierce advocate to make sure that the state is pulling its weight and being a great partner for us. And so when I go and talk to leaders and everyday people in the town of Chelmsford, I hear that the state is not doing that. Commonwealth of Massachusetts is not pulling its weight. It's not being a great partner for the town of Chelmsford. And I think that's true for other places in the district. So just to kind of drill down into specifics on that, and I'm sure all of your viewers know, that for many years, Chelmsford has been getting the short end of the stick in Chapter 70 funding. And it's gotten to a point where Chelmsford it's punching above its weight significantly in terms of the quality of the school, of the public schooling, relative to the amount of state aid.
All you have to do
that's
is look
being
at
received.
the DESI stats on the state education website to understand what you said is absolutely true.
You look at Burlington, you look at Westford, they're getting more per pupil, they're being able to pay their teachers more, and not all of that, but some of that has to do with the Chapter 70 formula. And again, there are great schools in Chelmsford, but we can't just expect that that's going to continue in perpetuity, especially because, and the town manager gave an excellent presentation on this to the Finance Committee, the Select Board, and the School Committee a couple of months ago. And he just laid out very clearly how, if you take into account inflation, the rising state aid for Chapter 70 funding is actually declining state aid in the years to come. And that's really troublesome. And it's not just important for the residents who have children in the school system. It's also important for everybody who pays property taxes.
Yes.
Because if the state isn't doing its share, who's going to bear the burden of maintaining the current quality of the schools? It's going to be everybody. And so we need somebody to go in there and advocate for a change to the formula, because it's not fair and it's not going to continue to work. I came from a great public school system, and I know what it did for me. I know what it did for my family and what it's allowed me to go out in the world to do. I've also worked as a special education teacher in an extremely under-resourced school, and now I work around the country in 5 cities in under-resourced schools. And I can see the difference. My argument in terms of why Chelmsford should get its fair share is that the people who graduate from Chelmsford schools, they're not just benefiting Chelmsford, they're working all over the place, Waltham, Burlington, and they're paying state income taxes. So we should get our fair share. It's really important, not just for people who have kids in the schools, but for all of the property taxpayers.
That is, I'll tell you, you and I are 100% on the same page. I've been having that same argument for at least 10 or 12. Well, when I was on the select board 15 years ago, I said pretty much the same things you did. And it's absolutely true. And you don't have to go too far to find the example. Now, most of us are reasonable people, whether we're liberals, conservatives, whatever you want to call us. But we understand that it is fair to have some sort of a distribution. As a Chelmsford taxpayer, I do not mind having a part of my property tax subsidize a poorer district. I don't mind that at all. It's fair. Okay, I've been very fortunate in my life. I was able to earn decent income. I do not mind having some of my tax dollars go into the city of Boston, Cambridge, Lowell, Lawrence, whatever. What I object to as a Chelmsford taxpayer is subsidizing the school children in Westford, because the equalized property valuations in Westford are higher than they are in Chelmsford, and the per capita incomes are higher. So as an aggregate body, the Westford citizenry is wealthier than the Chelmsford citizenry. Why does the Chelmsford, Massachusetts state income tax payer have to subsidize the children in Westford?
Right.
That's wrong.
And the result, part of the result,
Yeah.
is that it puts an incredible burden on the town to provide all of the other services that are needed.
Correct.
And the people who rely on those services are not just middle class and wealthier people. Sometimes they're poorer people
Yes.
too, quite often. And so it does have a disparate impact on the neediest residents in the town.
That's a good point.
And so, I mean, that would be a big part of my argument. I think a lot of this job is listening. That's really, really important. But as I go around to people in Chelmsford, you know, there are issues that I hear about again and again and again. And so at a certain point, the job turns into one of advocacy. And Sam, I've advocated for special education students in low-income schools, and I've been successful, and I've helped them win. And I've advocated in some of the hardest, most high-profile, sensitive prosecutions on behalf of the United States in the public corruption realm. And I've won. And I want to win for this district. I want to win for the residents of this district.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're certainly on the right track, and you appear at least to have two qualities that I consider very important in anybody who seeks political office. Number one, you appear to be a people person. You like people. People who don't like people shouldn't get into politics. Just my opinion, folks. Okay. And I think we all can point to some examples, maybe that
We won't name names.
And yeah, and so the first requirement is, well, obviously, you know, honesty and integrity obviously is right on top of the list. But you have to be a people person, and you have to be a listener and an advocate at any level. And at this particular level, I mean, this is what I would call entry-level politics. You know, one level above town politics, obviously. And this is again where the rubber hits the road. And you know, your job is listening and trying to advocate for people who many times feel they have no voice and nobody who will listen to them. So you mentioned talking to residents and so forth, and I'm sure you know you've done your legwork in Concord and Carlisle and Acton as well. But what are people saying? What seems to be the hot buttons that you're hearing from people relative to their local concerns?
Yeah, so I want to touch a little bit on housing.
Yes.
It's a hot button issue. It's a very complicated issue, and it relates very much to the ability to stay in our local community as people age. These are the people who have built this community. Many of them, especially in Chelmsford, are veterans who have not only served the community, but have served our country and sacrificed. And there is a significant amount of public housing in the town of Chelmsford. There's about 176 units, in my understanding, doing public housing, and a lot of that is senior housing. And I know that there are some big plans for some additional housing. One of the issues that I've heard about, and I think it needs to be brought to the forefront, is what is the state doing to make sure that those units are maintained so that people can live safely and with dignity? There's an incredible housing authority in the town with great leadership, but there were 3 ceiling collapses in these units recently, and the state's only giving about $250,000 a year for capital maintenance of these units. And so, I mean, you talk about the people who need the most help. How about our seniors and our veterans who are living in these units, and the state's not being as good a partner as it perhaps should be? So I'd be really focused on making sure that our housing stock where seniors are living is maintained appropriately. That's important for a number of reasons. It's important for a humanity reason, but it's also important for an economic reason, because the alternative is that these people go into nursing homes, and then the state is paying way more money
Yes.
For them, and their health is probably going to degrade faster in a nursing home. At least that's what we understand at this point. So that is something that I would be focused on. I think it's really, really important. It's a pressing issue in Chelmsford, and there are a lot of issues, but there are some issues where the state is particularly well positioned to help, and I think that that's one of them.
Yes, and again, I think that is reflective of a lot of the concerns from people. Chelmsford does have a pretty good older population, depending on, I don't know how you define older. I mean, I'm going to be 75, and I don't think of myself as old, but, you know, that's, but, you know, not everybody has that perspective. But this is something that I think has been a problem for many years in the town, and you're absolutely right. We have a very good housing authority, and one of the best directors in the state, in my opinion. Dave Hedison is one of the best, and certainly one of the most knowledgeable. So we have about 3 minutes left, Simon. I tell you, this half-hour format goes very, very quickly, and I'm sure we'll have you back as things progress. You know, we have until the primary is in September, correct?
That's right,
so
September 6th.
We have several months between now and then, and I'm sure we'll have you back because I think you know, your candidacy warrants further discussion. I think people deserve to have as much exposure to you as they can have, because we all want to make informed choices when we vote. So you talked about housing. The other real problem, and you talked about Chapter 70, I think those are the two really hot button issues, especially with regard to the economy and so forth. We do have a post-employment benefits liability problem everywhere in the state. So just very, very briefly, is there anything you think the state could do to assist communities in that area?
Yeah. So there are a couple of things that could happen. Probably one of the toughest decisions would be austerity measures. And the reason that those could be implemented is because the town would be at risk of not being able to provide basic services because those benefits are becoming so expensive. Another thing that we can do, and I think the best solution, is to do something about the rising cost of healthcare, because that's the biggest driver of those costs. And so the state, again, we're talking about things that the state is well positioned to do. The state is well positioned to start to bring down the cost of prescription drugs and bring down the cost of healthcare, and that would potentially put us in a position where we didn't have to make hard decisions about who gets those benefits. I think, you know, the most important first thing to say about that is to make sure that people who are close to retirement age don't lose what was promised to them, because that to me would be unacceptable. But it's a significant financial issue for the towns, and it's only going to get worse and worse moving forward unless we do something about it. Well, and the best way is to lower our healthcare costs.
That is a very interesting perspective, and I agree with you. So we have about 45 seconds. So do you want to talk to the voter at this point and maybe ask for the vote?
Sam, I'd love to, and I hope that it's the first of many times that I'm talking to everybody who's watching today. I'm running for state representative in the 14th Middlesex District, and I'm running to be your rep. I hope that I'll see you soon. I'm going to be at the special town meeting next week, so hopefully I'll get to see some of you. I know I'll be hearing about some really important issues. If you'd like to learn more about my campaign and candidacy, I hope you'll reach out to me. Our website is www.simoncataldo.com, and I just really look forward to meeting more residents around the district.
And that's great. And